Forget about the tip of the iceberg. This is the tip of the tip. There is so much in there.
It can infiltrate and be a massive headwind for all aspects of the business at all layers.
These little details, they seem innocuous, but if you try to make everything work at the same time, you actually find yourself pulling in different directions.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode.
Hey, I'm Chris Saab.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And on this week's show, we're going to talk through a blog post I wrote recently about the 4 big execution mistakes you're probably making right now. These are mistakes that I've been bumping into over the last few weeks. They've been stressing me out. I've been helping founders avoid them. And there's a lot of key nuances that will help you avoid these dead ends, this wasted time, and fast forward to the best answers as quickly as possible. So all that and much more on this week's show right after the break.
You don't want to miss this one, folks. There is a plot twist at the end that will blow your mind. Stay tuned. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Cyber Matters. Cyber Matters helps startups and scale-ups get security compliance right the first time. Building a startup is hard enough, believe me. Founders do not have months to waste on paperwork, or even worse, dealing with the fallout of bad advice. The team at Cyber Matters run managed GRC programs, internal audits, and risk reviews, all designed to fit how tech companies actually work. From SOC 2 to ISO 27001, they cut through the noise, set up platforms like Drata, and keep you audit ready without slowing you down. Cyber Matters, practical security done properly. Visit cybermatters.io to get started.
All right, the first big execution mistake I wrote about in my post is oversimplifying. So let me quote myself here. In an effort to make things seem easy or to justify hedging, lack of focus, or simply because of a lack of engagement with key details, it's often easy to collapse, conflate, and obfuscate behind a simplified worldview. This oversimplification can lead to costly mistakes, oversights, and underinvestment in the details that really matter. It can also lead to false dichotomies when things are actually nuanced gradients or spectrums. If you look closely enough, the discontinuities disappear and a smooth path emerges. This has been a big part of my advisory work lately, revealing the hidden complexities inside these oversimplified things. So really what I'm talking about here, Yaniv, is founders and operators who will look at 2 things that appear similar, but actually they're not. Once you dig into the details and understand the nuances of those 2 things, you'll realize they're actually quite different in meaningful ways, and they require different features, they require different implementation details, they require different go-to-market strategies, they require different business models, they require different everything. And so, you can conflate people in California being basically the same as people in New York, or people in one use case being basically the same as another use case. But what's really important is you dig into those details and try to figure out the differences so that you can parse those differences out and take each thing one at a time.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating, Chris, because I think, and I know you're going to talk about taste and judgment pretty soon, because I think it's very relevant here, right? Like, the truth is, every person is unique. Every snowflake is unique, right? It is a mistake to say all snowflakes are the same, right? That's the oversimplifying that you're talking about. But it is also a mistake to say, well, every snowflake is unique, and therefore we can only address one snowflake with this product, right? There needs to be some sense of categorization where we draw that dividing line, where we find that leverage point, where we say, here is a group of people, or here is a domain, or here is a problem that is both sufficiently specific, but also sufficiently general that it is actually worth solving. We're not solving for one person. That's our software-backed services business, Chris. We don't want that. We need to find those generalities. But yes, to say, oh, all people are the same, or all 2 similar use cases are similar enough that we're just going to ignore all those nuances and differences. Yes, I agree that the world is always annoyingly more complicated than you wish it would be. And this is a very common mistake, and one that I find myself making if I'm not careful too.
Yeah, it absolutely takes a lot of taste and judgment to figure this out, because what you're talking about is granularity and abstraction levels, right? So you can finally cut the world down to individuals, and this is the second mistake, actually. It's called overcomplicating, or you can kind of blob everything together as one amorphous blob, which is oversimplifying. And finding that right level of abstraction is the key. And it's often, though, in this mistake, it's often much more differentiated, individuated than you might first expect, or the people that are making this mistake are expecting it to be. an example I often use, I don't know if it's the best one, but it is one I always think about, is imagine if you have a backlog of requirements for going out. So it's, wake up, put on your pants, do your hair, have a shower, get in your car. Well, unless you're Yaniv, no hair to do.
My hair's always done, baby.
Yes. Get in the car, drive to your destination and enjoy, right? That's a kind of a backlog of tasks to go out. But going out is a very broad use case. You actually have to decide, what is the goal of going out? Are you going out to pick up a package from the post office, or are you going out to a fancy dress ball? And those backlog of tasks radically change, right? So if you're going out to the post office, well, you can skip the shower, you can skip doing your hair. Your destination is a local strip mall or a local shopping center. And what you wear is completely different than what you'd wear to a fancy dress ball. So the implementation details change as well as the required tasks. If you're going out to a fancy dress ball, well, you got to put on fancy pants, but you can only do that after you have a shower, and then you got to do your hair, and then your destination is a completely different place. It may be, if you're a bit fancy, you even take a different car, right, to the fancy dress ball. And so it seems like the use case is easy, going out. Well, we're going to build tools for going out, but your backlog completely changes. And so this oversimplification is a really big deal. And the other thing that also comes to mind is people will see these two discontinuities. They'll say, well, actually, going out to pick up a package is completely different than going out to a fancy dress ball. And that is also wrong. So this is another symptom or another negative consequence of this oversimplification. They go, well, these are totally different. There's no way we could do either. And this thing over here is a completely different business. But actually, if you break it down to those constituent parts, right, putting on pants, having a shower, doing your hair, what you'll realize is that one is actually on the journey to the other. Meaning, if you tackle going to the post office first, and you do that well, and you don't conflate it with anything else, you're actually closer to handling the use case of going out to a fancy dress ball. Look, you're not there, but you're closer. So you've moved along a gradient, and the next adjacency, the next kind of going out, becomes an easier adjacency to tackle when you're ready. So and there might even be a few use cases between those 2 points that get you closer without having to jump to the other point. So I'm making 2 points here. One is, don't conflate those 2 points. They're very different, going out to the post office and going out to a fancy dress ball. But don't think that there is a massive discontinuity between them, and find points along the spectrum intentionally and when you're ready to slowly work along the point in the spectrum. So maybe in the middle there is going out for coffee, where you can have a shower, do your hair, but the clothes you might wear might be roughly the same as going to pick up a package. So the requirements change only slightly, and you can tackle that second use case more easily at the right time.
What you say makes sense to me, Chris. One of the things in my mind was the phrase, the details matter, right? And, when you see people struggling with vibe coding, or when you see non-technical people asking engineers or designers or product managers, why does it take so long to ship this simple feature? It's because the details matter, right? There is a sort of fractal level of detail. And to continue with your going out analogy, right? We can say, well, hey, I've just asked you to create a going out feature. And then you're like, but there are all of these questions you haven't answered. Is it going to the post office? Is it going to a fancy dress party? Do I even know how to walk, right? This is the terrible thing with software, is it's like, oh, God damn, like we don't even have the walking function implemented. So we need to learn how to walk before we can think about going out. And then, what's the weather like outside? What's in my wardrobe? Do I know how to shave? Do I have a shaving razor? All of this stuff that goes on and on and on. And it's unfortunate. And then what if things go wrong? What if I'm about to go out and I realize it's raining, or it is really hot, or any number of other things? And then we need to make sure that we can handle those cases. So yes.
That's a great example, right? So if you deal with going to the post office as your first use case, and this, we're going to blow this metaphor, beyond all recognition in this episode, I can tell.
Oh, I
can tell already.
We already have.
You could handle the use case of going to the post office with just a subset of those requirements in the backlog I started with, but you will not cover all conditions of going to the post office. You just mentioned a really good one. What about going to the post office in the rain? So to handle that use case really well, you're going to need to think about inclement weather. You're going to have to think about what happens when the car breaks down. You're going to have to think about what happens when the package isn't there when the customer arrives. And so by not conflating post office and fancy dress ball, it gives you the cognitive space to go deep enough on the post office use case to actually solve it for all cases. Before you start making fancy dress ball outfits, right? And you still haven't invented the umbrella feature. And so that's a really, really important extension of the metaphor, Yaniv.
So there's sort of two things. You're talking about saying, well, if once we've built all the functionality to go to the post office, we're part way to building the functionality to go to a fancy dress ball. And that is both true and not true, right? Like, it depends, because sometimes the things that you need to build, and like you said, we're breaking this analogy beyond recognition, but the things that you might be building in order to make a really effective trip to the post office are going to just be fundamentally different design decisions than the things you need to do to go to a fancy dress party. For example, the post office is generally open during daylight hours, so your functionality might be checking the time and making sure that it only works if it's between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock. Well, guess what? Fancy dress parties happen at night. And so that functionality you built is exactly at cross purposes to your fancy dress ball. And so these little details, they seem innocuous, but if you try to make everything work at the same time, you actually find yourself pulling in different directions. And then you need to add more complexity and logic to make sure that you can handle both going to the post office and going to the fancy dress party, because there are significant differences between the two.
Now, I want to stress, I think if a listener is listening to this and they might have forgotten the original context of this metaphor, and they might be thinking, well, obviously these things are different. What founders and operators often do is they say the use case is going out.
And it's $100 billion TAM. The going out industry is huge.
That's right, exactly. So you don't sleep on that part of my story, right? While having explained all of this, Yaniv and I, it might be easy to say, yeah, we get it, guys. Going out is different. Going to the post office is different than going to the fancy dress ball. But what happens is that founders will start with the use case going out, like leaving the house, and it will take them weeks, months, or years, or never to figure out, no, these are as different as going to the post office or going to the fancy dress ball. So yes, after we've described this for the last 5 minutes, it might seem obvious that these are different, but when you actually apply it to your use cases for different kinds of clinicians in healthcare, or different kinds of businesses in business, or different kinds of cities for insurance, or different kinds of countries for their proclivities for how they socialize, everything changes, and so you have to ask yourself, what are we overgeneralizing, oversimplifying, and how does that tease out different requirements and different implementation details? And also, are there points along the gradient between point A and point B that can help us move from A to B intentionally but gradually, so there isn't this big discontinuity where it's like we either do A or we either do B? There's actually often a way to move incrementally from A to B with intention over time.
Now, before we move to the next one, Chris, I just wanted to torture that metaphor one last time and come back to that point of, being able to figure out, using your taste and judgment, what is the right abstraction? What is the right level of granularity? I would argue that going to the post office is actually too narrow, right? Because really going to the post office, the requirements for going out of going to the post office are probably pretty similar to the requirements of going out and going to the corner store, or going out and going to the greengrocer, right? So probably the right thing is going out to perform simple errands, right? And that's already a larger market than the going to the post office market. And so this is where you're like, okay, we need to, without oversimplifying, find a category of things, in this case, a category of going out, that has so much in common that we can really cover that entire use case effectively without being too narrow.
Now, here's the thing. This is in reality, this is going to take taste and judgment, but just to sort of continue to break this metaphor, I can think of plenty of ways why those two things are completely different, right? Before you go to the grocery store, you need a grocery list. Before you go to the grocery store and have a grocery list, you might need a series of recipes you're going to cook for the week, right? And so that requires a different prerequisite and a different setup process. Going to the post office, on the other hand, you may need to first be notified when the package arrives. So you need a different kind of integration with the postal service, right? One is on demand, the other requires some kind of state to be true on the other side of the equation. So in my experience, most founders are conflating multiple ideas together more often than they are being overly specific. And being overly specific, if you again have some amount of taste and judgment about how you implement things, is rarely a hindrance to your future plans. I mean, you can definitely paint yourself into a corner where you like build your entire app is optimized around one very niche use case, and it's very hard to paint yourself out of that corner. But if you do it well, I tend to find that people need to be more engaged with the details and the differences than less.
Okay, we have thoroughly tortured that metaphor, so let's move on to number 2, Chris, in the big execution mistakes you're probably making.
Yes, number 2, now we've touched on this ever so slightly, is the concept of overcomplicating. Now, this is the opposite. If you think of a bell curve between oversimplification and overcomplicating, your sweet spot is somewhere in the middle, right? So oversimplifying is you're just conflating all the use cases together. You're not engaged with the details that differentiate the differences. But with overcomplicating, you are being obsessed with too many details and you're overstuffing your thing with ideas. So let me read what I wrote here. Domain experts, big thinkers, and philosophers are often stuffing way too many ideas into the mix. Simple problems, processes, or strategies become bloated. 2 concepts are used when one more elegant concept will suffice. 2 processes instead of 1. 2 brands instead of 1. You want the minimum number of ideas and no fewer, or you end up with problem number 1, right? With oversimplification. A big part of my advisory work has recently involved reducing the number of ideas, brands, surfaces, products, and approaches to reduce the work and increase the quality and cadence of execution. Genius and value creation is reducing the complex to the simple. Now, this might sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, and I am, because it is a bell curve. It is about understanding where to put the knife in the cake, where the level of granularity matters. But beyond sort of basically overcomplicating the details of a use case, there's also this sense of like, oh my God, we're building the Going Out app, and the Going Out app can also be the Discovering Friends app and Discovering Things to Do app and Finding New Hobbies app and Learning How to Play Piano app and the Weather app and it's like it's taking it from conflation. Well, we can help you go out and do anything to we can be your everything app and we can just help make your life better. And there are some founders and operators who just become sort of, they get sucked into this vortex of big, exciting, hairy ideas, and they forget failing to figure out the differences between subtle use cases. They forget to engage with the details of actually building anything. And that's a real problem as well.
So I guess it does sound like you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, but I think I've understood what the ambiguity is and how to disambiguate it, Chris. One thing you're talking about is looking at a problem, right? And oversimplifying that problem space and therefore oversimplifying the solution space. And then the other thing is just doing things that are unnecessary, right? Not focusing enough on the problem, focusing on things that are unnecessary, right? And so I guess, there's this concept of things needing to be necessary and sufficient, right? To solve a problem, you need to implement a solution that is sufficient, meaning it has all of the elements that are necessary to solve that problem. And number 1, Chris, where you talk about oversimplifying, that's where you end up glossing over all the things that are necessary to solve the problem. And therefore, you don't end up with a sufficiency, right? You don't actually have all the pieces in place to properly solve the problem because you've bitten off more than you could chew. But number 2, overcomplicating, this is about what is necessary. So once you have defined the right problem that you're solving, you should only do the things that are necessary to solve that problem. If you're doing things beyond what is necessary, then you are overcomplicating. So necessary and sufficient are 2 ends of this, right? Where we're talking about like, we must do everything that has to be done to solve that problem and nothing else. Hence, do not oversimplify the problem space and the solution space. Do not overcomplicate your solution once you have identified the correct space.
Let me continue to use some simple, concrete examples from every day. So if oversimplification is saying, going to the post office and going to a fancy dress ball is the same, you might forget the nuance of, well, you might take a Corolla to pick up the package, or you might take your fancy car or whatever, a Lamborghini, Porsche, or even just a nicer, your nicer Mercedes to the fancy dress ball. And so it's not recognizing that even in the mode of transport, the style, the brand, the approach might differ. With overcomplicating, you're looking at going to the post office, going to the grocery store, going to the ball, going to a water park, going on a road trip, and you're saying each of those requires a different car. I'm going to rethink the car from the ground up for each use case. And it's like, no, you don't need that either. There's a sort of a set of cars, maybe 2 or 3, that can handle, you can categorize these by, casual going out, maybe utilitarian going out and fancy going out. And now you have 3 cars for the 7 use cases. I'll give you an even a more concrete example from a recent piece of advisory I've done where we're making a big announcement. And in order to help shape the messaging of the announcement, I wrote a blog post that tells the story of, who we are, what we realized, what's changing, and why things are not as scary as the change might suggest. And I wrote that as sort of the messaging template and framework. And I said, look, this is the key anatomy of this announcement. We can use this as a blog post, but we can also dissect it and use it in different parts for different formats. And then somebody else wrote a email to our users and wrote it from scratch. And I said, why don't you just copy and paste the blog post? And they're like, well, it's a different surface and it's a different medium and it's a different whatever. And I'm like, sure, modify it slightly, change the intro, change a word or two. But the blog post is basically saying what you wrote in the email, but you've made all this effort to rewrite it, right? So I'm not even just talking about the feature list or the strategy. I'm talking even down to reusing simple artifacts and not overcomplicating your work. I recently described it to another team I was advising as, guys, I'm really lazy. I like to do the least amount of work possible. Can we not just repurpose this thing to that thing? And it's like we put our very best thinking into the blog post. Why don't we just copy and paste it? Right? And so this overcomplicating can be everything from your strategy to your roadmap to the implementation details, right through to the kind of artifacts and work you're doing. Simpler is better as long as you're not, obfuscating and conflating details together.
So again, and I know this is sort of like my slightly nerdy way of thinking about things, but necessary and sufficient. Number 1 is saying, do what is sufficient and make it possible, feasible to do what is sufficient. Do not oversimplify and think that you've solved the problem when actually you haven't. And number 2, overcomplicating, is saying, do only what is necessary. Do not do unnecessary things, right? To your point, rewriting copy when you have perfectly good copy, that is not necessary. And you have justified it through overcomplicating things, through over-intellectualizing, doing the classic midwit thing, right? Of like, oh, but this and that. It's like, no, you know what? Like, we've got great copy. We've got a clear message. Let's use it again, right? And so do only what is necessary and do everything that is sufficient to solve a real problem for real people out in the world.
In the first case, often the reason why people are oversimplifying is because they're trying to justify their hedging, right? They don't want to make a particular choice in case they're wrong. They want to justify the resulting lack of focus, or simply because they're not engaging with the details of the problem enough to understand the subtleties and differences. With the overcomplicating, sometimes that happens because they're really big thinkers and their mind sort of spiders out to all the implications. Sometimes they're doing it because they're domain experts and they're aware of all of the complications of the domain and they don't know how to simplify. They don't have the craft of product and business strategy to know how to create categories and simplify things. They're admitting all of the variations and all of the opinions of the domain instead of picking one best practice that they want to approach with. And sometimes they're doing it actually because they think they need to justify their existence. So if I'm the email writer and I've been handed the script by the social media person or the product marketer, well, I feel like I have to add value, right? I have to do something unique to the email writing channel. And so to justify my pay I almost have to do more work. Whereas that work may just be, remixing something for no reason. So for those are some of the reasons why oversimplification and overcomplication can occur.
Scaling fast? Congratulations! Do not let compliance trip you up. Cyber Matters makes GRC simple. Policies, audits, and risk management built for real companies, not tick box exercises. Go to cybermatters.io to learn more. That's cybermatters.io.
Hey, before we get back into the show, a quick reminder. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications and spread the word about the podcast. It helps us grow the show, which in turn helps us help more founders like you. Thanks so much. Okay, with that, back to the show. All right, the next big mistake you might be making of the 4 that I wrote about is miscategorizing things. Yaniv, this is one of my favorites as well. Let me read what I wrote. One of the hardest things to do is to name things. The next hardest thing is to group things into categories that are mutually exclusive but collectively exhaustive. Naming conventions, careful attention to abstraction levels, and a strong grasp of language and cognition are critical here. A big part of my advisory work lately has involved looking at a problem domain from first principles and asking questions like, what is the most straightforward name to give this thing? What is the right abstraction level for this collection? What is the complete list of self-describing categories that can encapsulate the whole problem without overlaps? So this is a really interesting one. Engineers know that one of the hardest problems in engineering is naming things, but it's actually one of the hardest things in product marketing, and business is to name things well and then to categorize them well so that your user interface is great, but also your business strategy and your programs, your processes, your squads, your job titles, everything about everything you're building makes sense to people, but if they just read the label without having to understand all the institutional knowledge.
What this reminds me of is the Feynman technique, named after the very famous physicist Richard Feynman. And basically, that is a fancy way of saying you don't really know something until you're able to explain it clearly to a 5-year-old. Now, why is naming things hard? Why is categorizing things hard? Because actually, the art is to understand the underlying domain well enough, right? Like the underlying thing that you're naming or the underlying structure of the set that you can actually name it effectively, that you can actually give it a meaningful category. So it's one of those sort of tip of the iceberg things. If you really know your stuff in that domain, then naming things is not hard, then categorizing them is not hard. But if your knowledge is a bit shaky, then that is revealed through challenges naming things and challenges categorizing things. So to me, like you said, look at problem domains from first principles and ask those questions. These are really about understanding what is underlying, right? What is beneath the question of like, how do we name this thing or how do we categorize this thing? Is this deep, nuanced, textured understanding of the domain. And that is hard-earned work.
Again, this is a bell curve, I think, because I find the people that struggle with naming things, I won't say the most, but equally, are domain experts as well. They know the domain too well. And they struggle because they are sometimes wrapped up in details that don't make a difference. They don't make a difference to the end user or to the team or to the marketing program. And so they're struggling and they're wrought with indecision because like, well, this thing is actually technically different. It's because of that thing. So that they're operating at the wrong abstraction level and they're looking at the wrong details.
Sure. And there's an idiom for that too, right, Chris? It's like you cannot see the forest for the trees, right?
Exactly.
If you know too much about trees, you might look at a whole bunch of trees in a contiguous space and say, well, this bit is like pine trees and that bit is technically not forest because they're not trees, they're shrubs. And it's like, this is a different canopy type and blah, blah, blah. And like, it's a motherfucking forest, right? Anyone can see that.
So it's about knowing which details matter for the category, which depends on the use case and the target audience. And the other reason why domain experts tend to struggle with this is because they're suffering from domain dogma. So there is an internal jargon that the domain has that people just named something because someone started calling it something, and that's just what the internal people, call it. That's what everybody in the field calls it. But when you're trying to communicate to an external party, to a user that might be less sophisticated, they have no earthly idea why it's called that. And it's just a confusing name. And so what you end up needing is somebody outside the domain saying, I'm sorry, that may seem perfectly reasonable as a name for you, and that's what everybody in the domain uses, but it doesn't make any sense as a self-describing label. And this product is not for that domain. It's trying to mainstream or generalize or make it easier, make the domain easier for people. And so, yeah, it's another bell curve where if you're not familiar enough to understand the nuances that matter, it's hard to name and categorize things. If you're too familiar and you come from the domain, you may not be able to see the forest from the trees. And so it's very difficult. And I find naming mistakes, naming convention mistakes, and category mistakes, category errors, are huge sources of pain for engineering architecture, for software UI UX, for team organization, cross-functional squads and missions, for strategy, for product marketing. It can infiltrate and be a massive headwind for all aspects of the business at all layers. So let's use some concrete examples to continue to stretch our metaphor beyond all recognition. So if you're building an app to help you go to the post office, do you call it go to the post office? Do you call it pick up a package? Do you call it the mail management app? What do you call this, and how do you make sure it's localized per country? Because different countries call this actually slightly different things. And then once you've figured out all of the sort of the errand activities or activities that are utilitarian, how do you group them? Do you group them by, well, these are errands and these are social activities and these are sort of special activities, right? What are the categorizations of these? How do you slice and dice these features? Is it from onboarding and discovery to planning to execution? So so therefore, how do you break the team up? What do you name the squads? What are their missions? How do you make sure that those missions are not overlapping, but yet covering all the pieces of the customer journey? So there's sort of both in the naming of the use cases when you're talking about it in product marketing and product positioning, all the way to how do you structure the team so you make sure you cover off all parts of the journey in the app, and everything in between, where naming can become kind of a real headache for just something as simple as the app that helps you go out and do things.
That's right. I mean, I think an example just to build on that, Chris, would be to talk about the difference between making a plan to go to the post office and actually going to the post office, right? Like, are these two distinct things or are they the same thing? Once you formed a plan to go to the post office and now you're going, is that a separate entity or is that simply a state of the plan to go to the post office that you're now going? This might seem unimportant until suddenly you realize that you had a plan that never eventuated and you're in the middle of it and it's not really clear what it even means anymore, right? Because all of this categorization ultimately resolves to meaning. Because everything that we're doing, and this is when we call it domain modeling, we're talking about something that is happening out in the real world, right? And we're trying to model it in software. And if we categorize things incorrectly, or if we don't get the states right, or if we don't name these things correctly, it starts to lead to a divergence between what's happening out in the world, what's happening in our brains, and what's happening on the computer. And then you have a really bad situation. So that's why it is so critical.
I'll give you an even simpler example. Is this a plan to go to the post office, or is it an event? Or is it a project? Or is it an errand? Or is it a task? Or is it a to-do item? Right?
Does it have to have a start time, or is the start time optional?
That's right. So it's, I just gave you 7 different ways of naming this entity of going to do the thing, right? And and that sort of depends on who your target market is, what your plan is for the future, where is this app heading, where are you going to generalize it, what's the second and third use case, what are the logical adjacencies, right? And so, and what is your mental model for the app? Is it a to-do list app, or is it an errand running app, or is it a travel app, right? And so, just to organize an entity called go to the post office, very interesting, very very challenging thing. The fourth and final big execution mistake you might be making that I wrote about in my post is mistiming things. When you have a big vision and a passionate team, everything can seem urgent and important. If everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. If nothing is a priority, then nothing will actually be finished, deployed, marketed, and scaled. And scale, of course, is the essential ingredient of success for a venture scale startup. It's right there in the name. However, if you have a clear strategy and a precise and intentional goal, a clear sequence of priorities will emerge. This is related to oversimplification. In a sense, it's saying everything is easy and then the same and can be done simultaneously. It isn't, and it can't. The details have to be unpacked and the order of operations must be carefully planned, or you'll find yourself taking a lot of actions but not making very much progress in the right direction. And so as I said there, Yaniv, this is an example of oversimplification, but rather than oversimplification just of concepts, it's also an oversimplification of time. It's sort of conflating and compressing and collapsing time and saying, well, all these details are basically the same, and therefore we can do them all basically at the same time, and we need to do everything at the same time because everything is urgent at the same time. And none of those things are true. None of them are true. And so you do not have to do the going out to the fancy dress ball use case at the same time as going out to the post office. You will have customers, you'll have the sales team, you'll have the marketing team, you'll have the investors say, come on, Chris, going to the post office is such a small use case. The TAM is so tiny. Surely you can just add this extra feature for, picking up a fancier car. And now you can handle going to the fancy dress ball. You are being too academic, too pedantic. You are being just a pain in my ass. And you are being too focused on too small of a use case. And I don't want to invest. And we have this huge opportunity from the fancy dress ball company. And if we could just support the fancy dress ball use case, we would be making millions of dollars right now. And it's like, no.
You know something, Chris? I just got the plot twist. I just got the Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father moment. I just got the Bruce Willis was dead all along moment in this. This is not 4 different mistakes. This is one mistake. And you have described it in 4 different ways. Oh my God, this is like the usual fucking suspects. Okay, here's what I am seeing from here, right? The underlying mistake here is that solving real problems in the real world is really bloody hard, and it is easy to underestimate that. That is what all 4 things we're talking about here are. Oversimplifying is underestimating how difficult and nuanced and subtle the domain is and how many different things can go wrong. We overcomplicate because we actually think we can afford to do things that aren't absolutely, strictly speaking, necessary with our very limited resources to solve this really difficult problem. We miscategorize things because we don't actually understand what it is that we're solving. And finally, we mistime things. We don't prioritize aggressively enough because we don't realize how much effort needs to go into solving even one part of this problem really, really well. And so we massively underestimate the challenge, the difficulty of doing all of this. We stroll into it underprepared, overconfident, and then we make all 4 of these mistakes. Am I right? Did I get it? Pat me on the back, Chris. Pat me on the back.
I think you're. I think actually you've gone to one abstraction too high. I think you're saying.
I see dead people. I see dead people.
It's interesting because now we're demonstrating these use cases, right? We're demonstrating these mistakes. I think you've gone one level too high, which is to say the common element is that it's really hard. Yes, it's really hard, but it's hard for many, many, many reasons. And this is a subset of those reasons. I think the common element here that is sort of in this part of the universe of hard is simply a lack of judgment. It's a lack of taste, judgment, and engagement with details. So you don't have the judgment to know when something is, when 2 use cases are different enough. And this is an aesthetic choice often, that these 2 use cases are different enough that the positioning, the business model, the feature set are going to be sufficiently different that you can't do both. It takes judgment to figure that out. It takes judgment to know, actually, this domain dogma, this domain inertia, this over conflation, this overstuffing of ideas, this artifact here is useful in this other situation here. It takes taste and judgment to know those 2 things are actually the same and can be simplified. It takes judgment and taste to know these 2 things belong in the same category, and this is the set of categories that make sense, that are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And then finally, it takes judgment and taste to say, and actually in this case, it takes a bit of confidence and discipline to say, no, we can wait. We can bet on ourselves and get this first use case right. We don't have to do everything at the same time. So I would say the common element here actually is taste, judgment, and discipline and rigor. Actually, now that I'm talking, the common thing they all have is rigor. That's the answer.
Yeah, okay. But let me stand my ground here, because I'm as sure of this as I'm sure that Luke Skywalker had the hots for his biological sister. This is about the fact, all 4 of these things are about the fact that there is so much of this nuance and texture. That's a word that I really like. All of these different things that happen in the real world that are really complicated. And all 4 of these mistakes come from underestimating that reality, right? From underestimating the fact that solving even a seemingly simple problem like going out is way, way, way harder than you ever expected. Forget about the tip of the iceberg. This is the tip of the tip, right? There is so much in there. And so the only way you have a chance in hell of successfully solving it is by avoiding all four of these mistakes, right? Is by really understanding, keeping it to what is necessary and sufficient, understanding the domain, and doing things in a really strict, rigorous priority order. Otherwise, you will not ever solve the problem.
Yeah, look, I think that makes sense. I think there's also, different vocabulary for describing the same thing. And yeah, the way I tend to describe this, and I've been describing this a lot, is long-time listeners of the show have heard me say the words taste and judgment over and over again. I would say taste, judgment, and rigor. You have to have the discipline and the rigor to dig into the detail and look for these details, look for these possible mistakes. But then you need to have the taste and judgment to make the call in the right direction. And so engagement with the details, teasing out the details, and then making the call in the right way. That's sort of the mental model I have in my head as I go about the world engaging with these problems. But look, it also takes a certain amount of distance from the problem. And again, I've said this a number of times on the show. I say this to the companies and founders I work with. While I do have a great deal of experience, I'd like to think I have great taste and judgment. I also have a massive cheat code, which is I am not involved in, I don't have the emotional and tactical obsession with this that you do. I have a certain amount of emotional and tactical distance. I'm a fresh pair of eyes. I'm a fresh batting hand, right? And so when you have anyone, even when it's someone who's not particularly experienced or that good at the job, just comes in fresh, they can ask some seemingly simple questions that help reveal some simple mistakes you might be making. And so you definitely need great, talented people on your team. Sometimes you need a fresh pair of eyes with that same taste and judgment. And that will go a long, long way to helping you avoid mistakes and fast forward to the best answer as quickly as possible.
Well, gosh, Chris, I'm sure there are people listening to this and going, boy, I need someone with that sort of taste, judgment, and emotional distance from my problem to help me. And I wish I could find someone like Chris to help me with that. Well, good news, Chris. I know this is what you like to do with companies. So if people want to work with you, how can they approach you?
Our segues are getting better than ever, Yaniv.
Better than God. I spent all day working on that one.
If you want to work with me or at least learn about what I do, you can find out about that over at chrissaar.com/advisory. But you don't have to go very far. It's basically stuff like we just talked about this whole episode. So let me know if I can be helpful with your startup. How about you, Yaniv?
I'm on LinkedIn trying to make the world a bit of a less boring place. So I love getting connection requests from TSP listeners. Hit me up for a connection. Let me know you come from the podcast and I will gladly accept it. All right, Chris, that was another fun episode. Thanks for sharing your wisdom on the top 4 mistakes that you're probably making today, and can't wait for the next one.
All right, catch you next one. Bye-bye.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Cyber Matters. Startup security doesn't need to be painful. Cyber Matters runs complex compliance programs that keep you audit ready and focused on growth. Check out cybermatters.io to learn more. That's cybermatters.io.